Turning your Bibles, if you would, to Job chapter 25. Job 25. This is a very short chapter. Bildad's a statement or third speech to Job, but he doesn't talk much, only 6 verses. And then Job's got 2 chapters of replies. We're just going to look at one of them since this chapter is so short. But let's start by reading verses 1 through 6, the whole thing of chapter 25. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered, "Dominion and all belong to him who establishes peace in his heights. Is there any number to his troops? And upon whom does his light not rise? How then can a man be just with God? Or how can he be clean who is born of woman? If even the moon has no brightness and the stars are not pure in his sight, how much less man, that maggot, and the son of man, that worm?" Well, what do you think of that? What do you think Bildad is saying in those few words he gives to Job? In the opening, what does he think of God? What does he think of God in that opening? Dominion, all, establishes peace at his heights. He's great, right? He is great. And then he talks about his army. How numerous is it? And then how can even man, when you think about man, can we be just before God? And the answer is clearly no, right? But then what does he think of man when he gets down to it? He's a maggot. I know. What do you think his point is? What is he saying to Job? What's his point?
Well, you're inferior. There's no way that you can be, it's almost saying there's no way that you can be righteous.
Yeah. Does that defeat his own argument? Because who are blessed of God? According to Bildad and Zophar and Eliphaz, the righteous.
Yeah.
The righteous are.
He's almost condemning himself and everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah, so it makes no sense to me, the things that he says here. But he is right. Nothing's lacking in the exercise of God. He is all things. He has at his disposal all the heavenly hosts. He can do whatever he wants. But he presents a very low view of humankind. Does God have the same view of mankind as Bildad? Who is the crown jewel of his creation? We are. And couldn't he have, once we sinned, couldn't he have just wiped us off the face of the earth and say, be done with it? We know that's true. So why did he keep us around? Because he loved us. He wanted to give us a chance. Bildad doesn't see this. Even David saw the all creation of God when he says this in the Psalm chapter 8 all throughout. He stood in awe of God's creation. What is man that you think of him? And you crown him with glory and majesty, he says in those verses. But we know, though, that sin has devalued us. But God doesn't leave us alone in that. He's going to make a way. He's going to make a plan for us, a way out so that we can have that relationship with him again. But let's go to chapter 26. I like how Job, he starts into this. This is really divided up into 2 parts. But let's read the first part, verses 1 through 4. I like the way he opens his response to Bildad. Then Job responded in chapter 26, "What a help you are to the weak! How you have saved the arm without strength! What counsel you have given to one without wisdom! What helpful insight you have abundantly provided! To whom have you uttered your words? And whose spirit was expressed through you?" So he's like, wow, Bildad, thank you so much. What grand wisdom. So I'm curious, who is it you're talking to? Why? Who is Bildad talking to? He's talking to Job, right? So Job's response is like, oh, wow. So who is it you're talking to here, Bildad? Because it ain't me. And by the way, whose spirit are you speaking from? And who are you speaking for is what he's really asking there in that verse 4. When he says, whose spirit was expressed through you. You could almost say he's asking the question, where'd you get your information, Bildad? Where'd you get it from? And that sets the course for what he's going to say next in verses 5 to the end of the chapter. He says there in verse 5, the departed spirits tremble under the waters and their inhabitants. Naked is Sheol before him, God, and Abaddon has no covering. He stretches out the north over empty space and hangs the earth on nothing. He wraps up the waters in his clouds, and the cloud does not burst under them. He obscures the face of the full moon and spreads his cloud over it. He has inscribed a circle on the surface of the waters at the boundary of light and darkness. The pillars of heaven tremble and are amazed at his rebuke. He quieted the sea with his power, and by his understanding he shattered Rahab. By his breath the heavens are cleared. His hand has pierced the fleeing serpent. Behold, these are the fringes of his way, and how faint a word we hear of him. But his mighty thunder, who can understand? So let's start there with verses 5 and 6. Interesting. Job's concluding view of the state of the dead, or pretty much being listed out here. I want to give you a summary of the way Homer Haley put this. I find this to be really well written. Homer Haley wrote of this section, death is the leveling experience of all mankind, from slaves to princes and kings, the great and the small. It is there the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. And he's quoting Job from chapter 3 in that part. Sheol is the place which none return, a realm of midnight darkness from which men rise not. But might he rise again? This is the question that is posed by Job over in chapter 14, verse 13. Perished the thought, no, he would not return, but since my Redeemer lives, remember when he talked about that in chapter 16, my Redeemer lives, maybe even after my body is destroyed, without my flesh, I shall see him, God. Remember when we discussed that, when he wanted to see God, meet God, in chapter 19. So all these things, all these thoughts, I think, from Job are building up to these ideas. Faith and hope waver all throughout, right, with Job. His faith and his hope. But every time we see that, we always see it kind of grow. I know my Redeemer lives. I don't understand why these things are happening. I don't know why God won't hear me, but he is my Redeemer. I know he lives. I know he's my righteous judge, that he will see me through this. But I see his faith, I see his hope growing, but it's always this kind of a up and down, but that up and down keeps going up and higher, and I see it happening here. Job recognized that this is the end of the wicked whom he discussed. It's death. And Job's expressions, spoken at various points all throughout from the very beginning, we see him struggling with this idea all throughout in his heart, in his mind, the things he says. He sinks, he rises from hopelessness and despair, but he always rises a little higher than he had before. God has complete control over the realm of the dead, which is referred to here as waters and Sheol and Abaddon. Some believe that Sheol was beneath the waters, and that's why sometimes water's used in that idea. But he sees that God's in control there. And in verse 7, This is a verse we know well, where he says, he stretches out the north over empty space and hangs the earth on nothing. We brought that up many times, talking about apologetics. And I think what he's saying here is simply, he's talking about the vastness of the space where God is at. That's where he is. The ancients, Job, I think, is back there before the flood, before things were written down for people to pull out and know things about God. They saw north as being that which was up and far away. And whenever we talk about going up, it's north, right? Because that's north on the map. You got the sky up there where you look up in the sky. What is the earth attached to? Nothing. And that's what he sees. Where is God but beyond the heavens, beyond all these things, beyond sight? The emptiness. There, that empty space, that's the same word Moses used to describe the world prior to God's creative acts. It's out there. And God fills, verse 8, his clouds with large amounts of water, yet they do not burst under their weight. And the flood, the whole earth, and flood the whole earth. The constant changing the clouds testify to the power and to the design of God. What Job is doing, he's describing the magnificence of God, and he's coming to a point here for Bildad. In verse 9, he obscures the face of the full moon and spreads his cloud over it. The full moon, here, God hides it behind the clouds. Who can do that? An entire small little moon planet up there that circles around us, and he can hide it. Think of it as if his throne is behind that, where God is. That's what I see him saying. As one looks at the horizons, he sees the boundary of light and darkness, but where's God in all that? Do you see him? The pillars of heaven, verse light. I think that's just a poetic way of saying, talking about the mountains up that are setting up high. We see those, the grandeur of them. Verse 12 and 13, you have that phrase Rahab and the fleeing serpent. Rahab can be translated as storms. It can sometimes, or some translations translate it as some sort of monster. I think it's probably a storm here in these verses. But they're the chaotic forces restrained by the Lord. Homer Haley says on this, whether Rahab is considered a sea monster that stirs up the sea or the arrogance of man that stirs up storms in society, God is able to quiet both. And so Job marvels at the might and the power of God. And so he says there, as he ends out the key, verse 14, behold, these are the fringes of his ways. The fringes of his ways. So what is a fringe?
The edge.
Yeah, the edge. It's, you get this whole blanket, and we see the fringe. So he's saying, how much do we know about God? How much do we really know? And if you think about Job's day, they didn't have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They didn't have anything. Only what was passed down to them. What do we know? We don't know anything. And then he says, and how faint a word we hear of him. But his mighty thunder, who can understand? Bildad is what he's saying. Bildad and Zophar and Eliphaz are speaking as if they know all the things about God, but what do they really know? Nothing. They don't know anything. And that's why he opened up with that sarcastic comment. Oh, wow, wise words, Bildad. So who are you talking to? And where are you getting this from? From between your ears, because it didn't come from God. Job is relating the greatness of God in his creation. God has complete control over Sheol, the realm of dead, which is pictured being beneath the waters here. In contrast, he also exercises dominion over the highest heavens, the place where he's enthroned. There, verses 7 through 10. And God demonstrates his authority over the mountains, the pillars of heaven, by causing them to shake, either by an earthquake or by thunder or whatever it might be. But God is the ruler over everything. And so he concludes, these are the fringes. He's saying that the activities he's describing did not even begin to cover the great works of God, and yet here you are speaking of the crown jewel of God as what? Maggots and worms. Have you ever made something and you were real proud of it, and you wanted to show it to somebody, and they said, wow, that's junk? How would you like that? My kids love to bring me things that they make. And whenever they bring it, I always compliment how great it is, because I know they're very proud of it. God is not a child like us. When he makes something, he makes it wonderful, and he has purpose behind it. And when we call it a maggot or a worm, we degrade the creation of God that he sent his own son to die for, what are we doing? What are we talking about? We're talking about the creation of God. When we say to somebody, man, I hate you, who are we hating? What are we? A creation of God. I may hate what they're doing, or maybe I hate what they said, but I better be careful about hating them, because God loved them so much, he gave his own son to die for them. God is in control of all things, us individually, the church, all people, those who are living and those who are dead. And Paul wrote, or exclaimed in Romans 11:33, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and unfathomable his ways." We study God's word. We have the whole plan of salvation right here. We study it. How much do we really know about God? Not a rhetorical question. What do you think? How much do we know about God? We're still on the fringes, I think. We just know a little bit. He shared with us just a bit for us. Here's why I made you. I'm going to send my son to die for you. Here's the way I want you to live. And I love you. And that's what we know. He's the creator of all things. How can we possibly really know God in the state we're in today? We can never really know him to that full extent. We can know him as much as he's shown us here. But when we get there, we'll know. And we should always be careful the words we say and think things through. I'm always nervous about the things I say. I like to write it down and try to hold to it, because I know when I'm up here, I'm not just speaking to you, but God is listening too. I got to be careful about what it is I say. Interesting chapters here, chapter 25 and 26. I kind of monopolized it. Any comments or questions or anything interesting you saw that you want us to go back and take a look at in those two chapters?